Welcome back to Mildly Interesting and Sleepy. The night is settled in around you, and that is exactly where we want to be. Because what we are going to talk about tonight is the kind of thinking that happens in the dark, in the quiet, in the space between waking and sleeping, where the mind does some of its most interesting and least supervised work. Tonight we are going into the life and ideas of Sigmund Freud. Freud is one of those figures who has become so thoroughly absorbed into the culture that it is almost impossible to see him clearly anymore. The couch, the cigar, the Oedipus complex, the Freudian slip, the unconscious, the id and the ego. These have become so much a part of how we talk about ourselves and each other that their origin is often forgotten. We use Freudian language the way we use the internet, without much thought for who built it or why or at what cost. The honest assessment of Freud, the one that does justice to what he actually did and what it actually means, requires holding two things simultaneously. On the one hand, Freud was one of the most original and consequential thinkers of the 20th century, a man who fundamentally changed how Western civilization understands itself, who put the idea of the unconscious mind at the center of human self-understanding in a way that has not been dislodged even by the discoveries that have overturned many of his specific claims. On the other hand, many of his specific claims are wrong, some of them in ways that caused real harm to real people, and the scientific status of his work is genuinely contested in ways that deserve honest acknowledgement. Both things are true. Freud was important and Freud was wrong, and understanding how both of these can be simultaneously true is one of the more interesting intellectual exercises available to a curious person. Let us begin with the man and the world he grew up in, because Freud without Vienna and without the 19th century is impossible to imagine. Vienna and the Jewish bourgeoisie, where Freud came from. Sigismund Shlomo Freud was born on May 6, 1856, in Freiburg, Moravia, which is now Pribor in the Czech Republic. He was the first child of Jakob Freud, a wool merchant, and Amalia Nathansohn, Jakob's third wife, who was 20 years younger than her husband. The family was Jewish, as were most of the people in Freud's world throughout his life, and this fact shaped everything about his life and work in ways that are impossible to separate from the ideas themselves. When Freud was 4 years old, the family moved to Vienna, where he would spend almost his entire life, 83 years in total, before being forced out by the Nazis in 1938. Vienna in the second half of the 19th century was one of the great cultural capitals of Europe, the seat of the Habsburg Empire, a city of enormous intellectual vitality and equally enormous social contradiction. It was a city where brilliant Jewish intellectuals and artists had achieved remarkable prominence in cultural life, and also a city where anti-Semitism was a constant, corrosive presence in public life, where social advancement for Jews was possible in some domains and completely blocked in others. Freud was a brilliant student and worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood early that his advancement would depend entirely on merit, because the social and institutional advantages available to his non-Jewish contemporaries were not available to him. He considered careers in law and politics before settling on medicine, partly because medicine was one of the fields where a Jewish man of his generation could actually advance. He enrolled at the University of Vienna Medical School in 1873 and took 8 years to complete his degree, spending much of the extra time doing research in the laboratory of the physiologist Ernst Bruch, whose rigorous commitment to empirical science shaped Freud's early intellectual formation profoundly. Bruch's laboratory was part of the Helmholtz School of Medicine, which insisted that all physiological phenomena could ultimately be explained in terms of physical and chemical forces, without reference to anything supernatural or vitalistic. This commitment to a purely physicalist account of biology shaped Freud's ambitions. He originally wanted to be a research scientist, to understand the nervous system in purely mechanistic terms, and the psychoanalytic theory he eventually developed retained the shape of this ambition even when it moved far beyond anything that could be directly observed or measured in a laboratory. Financial reality pushed him into clinical medicine. Research positions did not pay well, and Freud needed money. He had fallen in love with Martha Bernays, a woman from a respectable Hamburg Jewish family, and he wanted to marry her. They were engaged for 4 years while Freud worked to establish himself sufficiently to support a family. He took a position at Vienna General Hospital, training in several specialties including neurology, and in 1886 he opened a private practice as a neurologist and began seeing patients. The patients who came to Freud in the 1880s and 1890s brought him problems that medicine at the time was poorly equipped to address. They had symptoms, sometimes dramatic and debilitating symptoms, for which no physical cause could be found. Paralysis without neurological damage, blindness without damage to the eyes, inability to speak without any throat or laryngeal problem. The medical establishment called these conditions hysteria, from the Greek word for uterus, reflecting the widespread belief that they were primarily a female complaint connected somehow to the reproductive system. The treatment options were limited and largely ineffective. Charcot, Breuer, and the road to the talking cure. 2 encounters were particularly formative for Freud in the years before he developed psychoanalysis, and both deserve careful attention because they show how the ideas that would become his most famous contributions actually emerged from the clinical work of treating patients. The first was Jean-Martin Charcot. In 1885, Freud won a travel grant that allowed him to spend several months in Paris studying with Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital, which was at that time the most important center in the world for the study of hysteria and neurological disease. Charcot was a towering figure in 19th century medicine, a brilliant clinician and demonstrator who had brought rigor and systematic observation to the study of conditions that most of his contemporaries dismissed as malingering or moral weakness. He demonstrated that hysterical symptoms could be induced and removed by hypnosis, and he argued that hysteria was a genuine neurological condition rather than a moral failing. Charcot's use of hypnosis was theatrical as much as therapeutic, involving public demonstrations of hypnotized patients before large audiences, and some of his specific claims about hysteria have not held up to subsequent scrutiny. But what Freud took from him was the conviction that hysterical symptoms were real, not fabricated, and that they could be produced and removed by psychological means, which implied that psychological factors were genuinely causing physical symptoms. This was a significant and not obvious claim in 1885. The second formative encounter was with Joseph Breuer, an older Viennese physician who was Freud's friend, mentor, and collaborator in the early years. Breuer had treated a patient he called Anna O, whose real name was Bertha Pappenheim, in the early 1880s, before Freud's visit to Paris. Anna O had developed a remarkable collection of hysterical symptoms, including paralysis, visual disturbances, multiple personalities, and the inability to speak German, her native language, though she could still speak English. Breuer discovered that when she talked about her symptoms under hypnosis, recalling the circumstances under which each symptom had first appeared, the symptoms were relieved. Anna O herself called this process the talking cure, and the name has stuck. Breuer's treatment of Anna O was the first systematic use of what would become the psychoanalytic method. the use of verbal communication to explore the psychological origins of physical and emotional symptoms. The case was foundational, and Freud and Breuer published it in their joint work studies on hysteria in 1895, which is often considered the founding document of psychoanalysis. The relationship between Freud and Breuer eventually became difficult and then ended. Breuer was cautious and empirical, where Freud was ambitious and theoretical. When Freud began developing his ideas about the sexual origins of neurosis, Breuer became uncomfortable and skeptical. The rift between them was partly personal, partly professional, and partly about the difficulty of maintaining a friendship when one person is moving in a direction the other cannot follow. What Freud took from both Charcot and Breuer, and what he built on in the years that followed, was the conviction that symptoms that appeared to be purely physical were often rooted in psychological experience, specifically in psychological experience that the patient was not consciously aware of. The unconscious, the idea that there was a part of the mind that operated below the level of conscious awareness and that profoundly influenced conscious thought and behavior, was not Freud's invention. The word and the concept existed before him. What he contributed was a systematic theory of what the unconscious contained, how it worked, and how its contents could be accessed and brought to light. The unconscious, Freud's central idea. The unconscious mind is the foundation on which everything else in Freud's theory rests, and it is worth spending real time on what Freud meant by it, because the concept is often invoked without much precision about what is actually being claimed. The basic claim is simple but radical. A large portion of our mental life, our desires, our fears, our memories, our motivations, operates below the level of conscious awareness and shapes our thoughts, feelings, and behavior in ways we do not and often cannot recognize. What we think we want is not always what we actually want. What we think motivates us is not always what actually motivates us. The reasons we give for our actions are often post hoc rationalizations rather than genuine explanations. The real explanation lies in material that is not available to conscious inspection. This idea that we do not have transparent access to our own minds, that there is a gap between what we consciously believe about ourselves and what is actually driving our behavior, is one of the most consequential ideas in the history of psychology, and its general form has been substantially validated by subsequent research, even when Freud's specific account of what the unconscious contains and how it works has been revised or rejected. We know now, from decades of cognitive psychology and neuroscience research, that the vast majority of mental processing occurs below the level of conscious awareness. That conscious deliberation plays a much smaller role in decision-making than people believe it does, that we are systematically mistaken about our own motivations in ways that Freud would have found familiar even if he would not have recognized all of the specific mechanisms. Freud's specific account of the unconscious was more elaborate and more theory-laden than the simple claim that mental processing occurs below consciousness. He believed the unconscious was primarily a repository of repressed material, thoughts, memories, desires, and impulses that were too threatening or painful or unacceptable to be allowed into consciousness, and that had therefore been pushed down, actively excluded from awareness by a psychological mechanism he called repression. The repressed material did not simply disappear when it was pushed into the unconscious. It continued to exert pressure, seeking expression, generating symptoms when it could not find direct expression, appearing in disguised form in dreams and slips of the tongue and jokes and artistic productions. This dynamic unconscious, an unconscious that is not simply a passive storage of inactive memories, but an active force in constant tension with consciousness, is Freud's specific contribution to the idea of the unconscious. The unconscious was not a basement where old furniture was stored. It was a furnace, hot and pressurized, constantly trying to push its contents upward, constantly being held down by the mechanisms of repression and defense. The contents of the unconscious, in Freud's account, were primarily sexual and aggressive. These were the desires that civilization most thoroughly suppressed, the impulses most incompatible with the social life that civilization required. And because they were most suppressed, they were most present in the unconscious, most energetically seeking expression, most responsible for the symptoms and the distortions and the dreams that psychoanalysis was designed to interpret. The interpretation of dreams, the Royal Road. In 1899, Freud published what he considered his most important work, though the publisher dated it 1900 to make it the first major psychological work of the new century. The interpretation of dreams presented his theory of dreams, argued that dreams were not random neurological noise, but meaningful mental events that could be interpreted to reveal unconscious wishes, and provided the detailed theoretical machinery for doing this interpretation. The famous claim is that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, the most direct access available to the material that repression keeps out of conscious awareness. During sleep, Freud argued, the mechanisms of repression relax somewhat. The unconscious wishes that cannot find expression during waking life seize the opportunity to express themselves. But they cannot express themselves directly, because even in sleep the censoring function of the mind is partially active. So the unconscious wishes disguise themselves, undergoing a process of transformation that Freud called dream work, which converts the latent content of the dream, the actual unconscious wish, into the manifest content, the strange narrative of events and images that the dreamer actually experiences. The mechanisms of dream work that Freud described are among the most intellectually interesting elements of his theory. Condensation combines multiple ideas or persons into a single dream image, so that one dream figure might simultaneously represent several different people from the dreamer's life. Displacement shifts the emotional weight of a wish onto a seemingly unrelated object, so that a dream figure who seems emotionally important may be the container for feelings that actually attach to someone else entirely. Symbolism represents wishes through conventional symbols, many of them sexual, so that elongated objects represent the phallus and enclosed spaces, represent the vagina and staircases, represent sexual intercourse. The sexual symbolism is where Freud's dream interpretation most obviously tests modern patience. Not everything is a cigar, as the possibly apocryphal saying goes, and the relentless sexualization of dream imagery that characterized orthodox Freudian interpretation became a target for both scholarly critique and comedy. The broader claim that dreams have meaning and that the meaning is connected to the dreamer's emotional life and unresolved psychological conflicts has survived in attenuated form in some areas of contemporary psychology, though the specific mechanisms Freud proposed and the specific contents he emphasized have not been well supported by subsequent research. What the interpretation of dreams did, beyond its specific claims about dream symbolism, was establish the method of free association as the primary tool of psychoanalytic investigation. Free association, the instruction to say whatever comes to mind without editing or censoring the flow of thought, was Freud's replacement for hypnosis, which he had initially used but gradually moved away from. By listening to the free associations of his patients, attending not just to what they said, but to what they conspicuously did not say, what they repeated, what they avoided, what made them suddenly change the subject, Freud believed he could identify the unconscious material that was shaping their symptoms and their lives. The book was not an immediate success. The initial print run sold slowly. Freud was disappointed, but over the following decade, as his ideas attracted an international audience and as psychoanalysis developed into a movement rather than the work of a single practitioner, the interpretation of dreams was recognized as the foundational text and went through many editions. It remains one of the most influential books of the 20th century, not because everything in it is correct, but because it established a way of thinking about the mind that has shaped psychology, literature, art, and ordinary conversation for more than 100 years. The Oedipus complex and the development of the child. No element of Freud's thought has been more celebrated, more debated, more revised, and more parodied than the Oedipus complex. And like most of his ideas, it contains a kernel of genuine psychological insight wrapped in a theoretical elaboration that has not held up as well. The basic claim of the Oedipus complex is that between roughly the ages of 3 and 5, children develop sexual attraction toward the opposite-sex parent and hostile feelings toward the same-sex parent, whom they regard as a rival. For boys, this means sexual desire for the mother and hostility toward the father, combined with what Freud called castration anxiety, the fear that the father will punish the boy's desires by castrating him. The resolution of the Oedipus complex involves the boy repressing his desire for the mother, identifying with the father rather than competing with him, and internalizing the father's moral authority as his own superego. For girls, Freud proposed an analogous but differently structured complex, sometimes called the Electra complex, involving penis envy, desire for the father, and a more complicated and less clearly resolved process of identification with the mother. The sexual specificity of the Oedipus complex, the literal claim that young children have sexual desires for their parents, shocked Freud's contemporaries and continues to make many people uncomfortable. Freud was using the word sexual in a broader sense than everyday usage. He meant something more like sensual pleasure, bodily satisfaction of any kind, rather than specifically genital sexuality. But even in the broader sense, the claim that children's emotional development was fundamentally organized around desire and rivalry within the family triangle was radical. The underlying insight that is genuinely defensible, the insight that children's earliest relationships with their parents are foundational for subsequent emotional development, that the patterns of love and rivalry and identification established in the family are templates that get applied to later relationships, that the emotional residues of early childhood persist and influence adult life in ways the adult is not fully aware of. All of this has found considerable support in developmental psychology, even if the specific Oedipal mechanism that Freud proposed is not the right account of how these early patterns are established. Freud used the Oedipus complex as the hub around which he organized a comprehensive theory of psychological development. He proposed that children pass through a series of stages of psychosexual development: the oral stage, in which satisfaction is focused on feeding and the mouth; the anal stage, in which control over bodily functions becomes the primary arena of conflict; the phallic stage, in which the Oedipus complex arises; the latency stage, in which sexual development is relatively quiet; and the genital stage of adult sexuality. Fixation at or regression to an earlier stage, he argued, produced characteristic patterns of neurosis. The anal-retentive character, obsessively orderly and controlling, was fixed at the anal stage. The oral-dependent character, passive and needing constant reassurance, was fixed at the oral stage. The stage theory of psychosexual development has not been well supported by subsequent research, and the specific character types that Freud associated with fixation at different stages have not been confirmed in the ways he predicted. But the general principle that early experience shapes personality in lasting ways, that the patterns established in childhood create templates that persist into adulthood, is one of the most robust findings in developmental psychology, and Freud's insistence on the importance of early childhood was a genuine and important contribution to how we think about development. The structure of the mind: id, ego, and superego. In the early 1920s, Freud revised his model of the mind in a major theoretical development that produced the structural model he is most famous for: the division of the psyche into id, ego, and superego. The earlier topographical model had divided the mind into the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious. The structural model cut across these divisions and organized the mind into three agencies with different functions, different relationships to each other, and different relationships to the demands of the external world. The id is the oldest and most primitive part of the mental apparatus, the reservoir of unconscious instinctual drives, primarily the drives of eros, the life and sexual instinct, and what Freud called thanatos, or the death drive, the aggressive and self-destructive instinct. The id operates entirely on the pleasure principle. It seeks immediate gratification of its desires without regard for reality or morality. It is completely unconscious, has no sense of time, treats contradictory impulses as equally valid, and is entirely indifferent to the consequences of its demands for the person as a social being. It is, in the most literal sense, the animal inside us, the part that wants what it wants when it wants it and cannot be reasoned with. The ego is the part of the personality that develops out of the id through contact with reality. It operates on the reality principle. It seeks to satisfy the id's demands, but in ways that are realistic, that take into account the actual possibilities of the external world and the consequences of actions. The ego is partly conscious and partly unconscious, and it is the ego that performs the work of repression, keeping unacceptable id impulses out of consciousness and mediating between the id's demands and the constraints of reality and morality. The ego is the executive function of the personality, the part that has to negotiate between the id's demands, the superego's prohibitions, and the requirements of external reality. The superego is the internalized voice of authority, the moral agency of the personality that represents the values and prohibitions absorbed from parents and from the wider culture. It contains both the ego ideal, the standard of what the person aspires to be, and the conscience, the agency that produces guilt when the person acts in ways that violate that ideal. The superego is partly conscious, in the sense that we are aware of many of our moral values, and partly unconscious, in the sense that many of the punitive and self-critical messages it generates operate below awareness. The neurotic guilt that Freud observed in many of his patients, the sense of badness and unworthiness that attached to no specific offense, was the work of an unconscious superego operating on an entirely different schedule from conscious moral reasoning. The drama of the mind, as Freud conceived it, was the constant negotiation among these three agencies. The id demands gratification. The superego prohibits it. The ego tries to find a path between the two that can satisfy enough of the id's demands to prevent the pressure from becoming overwhelming, while avoiding the superego's punishment and navigating the constraints of external reality. Neurosis, for Freud, was the result of this negotiation breaking down. When the id's demands could not be adequately satisfied or adequately repressed, when the superego's demands were too punishing and too rigid, when the ego's capacity to mediate collapsed under the strain, symptoms developed. The id-ego-superego model is probably Freud's most culturally durable contribution. The language has entered everyday speech, in a way that none of his other theoretical constructions quite has. People speak of their id without necessarily believing in Freudian theory, using the word to mean the impulsive, appetitive, uncontrolled part of themselves. The ego has acquired a meaning in everyday speech, inflated self-regard, that is different from but not entirely unconnected to Freud's sense. The superego's voice is the inner critic, the punishing internal parent. The model maps onto something real about the experience of internal conflict that has made it resonant across a century of cultural change. The death drive, Freud's darkest idea. In 1920, in a short work called Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud introduced what he himself acknowledged was a speculative and difficult idea. The death drive, thanatos, an instinct in all living things toward dissolution, toward the return to an inorganic state, toward death. He introduced it partly to explain phenomena that his earlier theory could not account for, most notably the traumatic repetition he observed in patients who had survived the First World War. The war had shattered many of Freud's assumptions about human motivation. He had built his theory around the idea that the mind operated primarily on the pleasure principle, seeking satisfaction and avoiding pain. But he was seeing patients who compulsively relived their traumatic experiences in nightmares and flashbacks and behavioral repetitions, not seeking pleasure, but apparently seeking the very pain that had damaged them. Why would the mind return again and again to the most terrible experience of a person's life? The pleasure principle could not explain this. Freud's answer was the death drive, an instinct that operated in opposition to eros, the life instinct, driving organisms back toward the inorganic, toward dissolution, toward rest. In its most obvious form, it expressed itself as self-destructiveness, aggression turned inward. In its less obvious forms, it was present in every repetition, in every tendency to return to what had already been experienced rather than seeking the genuinely new. Civilization itself, Freud argued, in civilization and its discontents, could be understood as the outcome of the struggle between eros, which sought to bind people together in larger and larger communities, and thanatos, which sought dissolution and destruction. The death drive is the most philosophically controversial of Freud's major ideas, and it is also one of the most contested within the psychoanalytic tradition itself. Many subsequent analysts and theorists have rejected it while keeping other elements of Freudian theory. The empirical evidence for a specific biological drive toward death is weak. But the phenomenological observation that motivates it, the observation that human beings frequently return to painful experiences, repeat patterns that harm them, seek out the familiar even when the familiar is destructive, is real and important, and has not been satisfactorily explained by the alternatives. The concept of repetition compulsion, the tendency to repeat early relational patterns even when they are harmful, is one of the more clinically robust ideas in psychoanalysis, even among theorists who do not accept the death drive as a biological reality. People do reproduce the emotional patterns of their early relationships in their adult relationships. People do return to the traumatic. People do sometimes seem to seek their own suffering in ways that require explanation beyond simple preference for pleasure. Whether the death drive is the right explanation or whether other mechanisms produce the same phenomena is a genuinely open question. Freud's Vienna, the circle and the movement. Psychoanalysis was not merely a set of ideas. It was a movement, a community, a set of social and professional relationships that Freud managed with the combination of genuine intellectual generosity and sometimes authoritarian control that characterized his personality throughout his life. The Wednesday Psychological Society, which began meeting in Freud's waiting room in 1902 and later became the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, was the nucleus of the psychoanalytic movement. The early members were a remarkable group: Alfred Adler, who would later develop his own individual psychology; Wilhelm Steckel, Max Kahane, Rudolf Riedler. They met weekly to discuss cases and theory, and the discussions were productive and often heated. Freud presided, listened, responded, and shaped the direction of the conversation with the authority of the founder. As psychoanalysis spread, it attracted figures from across Europe and eventually from America. Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist at the Burgosli Hospital in Zurich, made contact with Freud in 1906 and quickly became the most important relationship in Freud's professional life in the years before the First World War. Freud saw in Jung not just a brilliant collaborator, but a potential heir, the person who could carry psychoanalysis beyond the Jewish Viennese context in which it had developed, who could make it a universal science rather than a Jewish science, which was how Freud feared it would be dismissed. The relationship between Freud and Jung is one of the great intellectual friendships and ruptures of the 20th century. They corresponded voluminously, traveled together, and developed their ideas in dialogue with each other for several years. Freud made Jung the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association in 1910 and referred to him as his crown prince, the successor who would inherit the psychoanalytic kingdom. The affection was real. The intellectual alignment was not as complete as it appeared. Jung had reservations about Freud's insistence on the primacy of sexuality in unconscious motivation, and he was developing his own ideas about the collective unconscious, archetypes, and psychological types that took psychoanalysis in a much more mystical and less strictly clinical direction than Freud was comfortable with. The break came in 1912 and 1913, and it was devastating to both men. Freud experienced it as a betrayal. Jung experienced it as liberation. The personal bitterness lasted for decades. The theoretical divergence produced two distinct and influential schools of thought that remain distinct today. The pattern of Freud's relationship with Jung, the combination of intense intellectual intimacy, high expectations, theoretical disagreement, and bitter rupture, repeated itself with several other important figures in the psychoanalytic movement. Adler left the movement, Steckel left the movement, and eventually almost every significant figure who had developed their own ideas that diverged substantially from Freud's was excluded or departed. Freud was not always the instigator of these departures, but the pattern suggests something about the difficulty of maintaining a movement organized around the ideas of a single dominant figure, a man who was simultaneously the most important theorist and the ultimate arbiter of orthodoxy. Freud on women, the most contested territory. Freud's ideas about women are among the most criticized aspects of his work, and the criticism is substantially justified. His theory of female psychology was built largely from his clinical observations of women patients and from theoretical extrapolations from his theory of male development, and it contained assumptions about women's nature and women's desires that were reflective of the deeply patriarchal culture he inhabited, and that subsequent research and feminist critique have comprehensively challenged. The concept of penis envy is the most famous and most contested. Freud proposed that girls, upon discovering the anatomical difference between the sexes, experience the absence of a penis as a wound, a lack, a source of ongoing envy and resentment. This discovery, he argued, shaped female psychology fundamentally. Women's relationship to their own desire, their tendency toward jealousy, their ambivalence about femininity, their relationships with men, all of this was organized around the fact of anatomical lack. The girl could only compensate for the missing penis by having a child, preferably a male child. The feminist critique of penis envy, developed most powerfully by thinkers like Karen Horney, Clara Thompson, and later by second-wave feminists, including Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir, is not difficult to state. The assumption that women's psychology is fundamentally organized around the experience of lacking male anatomy reflects a male perspective that takes male anatomy as the norm and female anatomy as its deficient variant. As Horney pointed out, if one were looking for evidence of cross-sex envy in the clinical material, one would find abundant evidence of womb envy in male patients, envy of women's capacity for pregnancy and childbirth, alongside the penis envy that Freud described in female patients. Freud focused on penis envy not because it was more clinically prominent, but because he shared, without examining, his culture's assumption that the male body was the standard. Freud famously said, late in his career, that what women want was the great question to which he had not found an answer. This admission of ignorance is more attractive than the specific answers he had proposed, because the specific answers were not merely wrong, but were organized around assumptions about women's nature that served to rationalize rather than explain their subordinate social position. At the same time, it is worth noting that Freud trained women analysts, that women played important roles in the psychoanalytic movement from early on, that his daughter Anna Freud became one of the most important psychoanalysts of the 20th century, and that the psychoanalytic consulting room was one of the few spaces in early 20th century professional life where women were full participants rather than subordinates. These facts do not redeem the theoretical failures, but they complicate the picture of Freud as simply a Victorian patriarch. Civilization and its discontents, Freud on Society. In 1930, Freud published Civilization and its Discontents, the work in which he extended his psychological theory to the analysis of culture and civilization as a whole, and which contains some of his most accessible and most compelling writing, alongside some of his most speculative. The central argument is both simple and disturbing. Civilization, the organization of human life in societies with laws and institutions and cultural achievements, is necessarily built on the repression of the instincts that psychoanalysis had identified as the deepest drivers of human motivation, primarily the sexual and aggressive instincts. Society requires that individuals give up the free expression of these instincts, channeling the energy they would otherwise consume into the work of civilization: labor, art, science, social cooperation. This channeling of instinctual energy into culturally valuable activities Freud called sublimation, and he saw it as the psychological mechanism that made civilization possible. But the repression that civilization requires has a cost. The instincts that are repressed do not simply disappear. They are dammed up, creating chronic frustration and discontent that is the normal condition of the civilized human being. We are not happy because we cannot be. The requirements of living in society conflict fundamentally with what our deepest nature demands. The neuroses that Freud saw in his consulting room were not aberrations, but exaggerations of the universal condition of civilized humanity. Freud wrote Civilization and its discontents in the shadow of rising fascism in Europe, and the book's pessimism reflects both his general theoretical framework and his specific historical moment. He ends the book with a passage that remains chilling. He asks whether Eros will assert itself against the death instinct in the struggle that civilization represents, and the answer he gives is uncertain. The book, published in 1930, did not anticipate the specific form that the coming catastrophe would take, but it captured something true about the psychological dynamics that were producing it. The book has been enormously influential beyond the specifically psychoanalytic tradition. The argument that civilization requires repression, that cultural achievement comes at a psychological cost, that there is a fundamental tension between the individual's instinctual needs and the demands of social life, has shaped political philosophy, cultural criticism, and the sociology of religion in ways that extend far beyond Freudian orthodoxy. Herbert Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, which proposed that the repression required by civilization was not necessary, but was specifically the repression required by capitalism, was a deeply Freudian argument even in its radical political deployment. Norman O'Brown's Life Against Death was another. The book's legacy in cultural theory has been enormous. The Last Years, Exile and Illness. The final decade of Freud's life was marked by two things that intersected in complex and sometimes terrible ways. The progressive oral cancer that had been diagnosed in 1923 and that required more than 30 surgical operations over the following 16 years, and the rise of Nazism in Germany and Austria that culminated in the annexation of Austria in March 1938, and the immediate threat that represented to Vienna's Jewish community. The cancer had begun, almost certainly, from Freud's lifelong heavy cigar smoking. He smoked 20 cigars a day for most of his adult life and refused for years to stop, even after the cancer was diagnosed, and even when his doctors made clear that smoking was making the disease worse. Whether this refusal represented an application of his own theory of the death drive to his personal behavior, a kind of unconscious self-destructiveness, or simply an addiction that he could not overcome despite his intellectual understanding of its consequences, is a question that Freud himself occasionally reflected on with his characteristic dark humor. He continued smoking almost until the end. The operations for the cancer were often extremely painful and left Freud with a prosthetic palate that made eating and speaking difficult. He worked through all of it, seeing patients, writing, maintaining his correspondence, continuing to develop and defend his ideas. The capacity for work under physical suffering that he demonstrated in these years was remarkable by any measure. The political situation in Vienna deteriorated rapidly after the Nazi annexation of Austria in March 1938. Jewish businesses and institutions were immediately targeted. The Vienna Psychoanalytic Society was dissolved. Nazi officials visited Freud's home and briefly detained his daughter Anna, which was the most frightening of the early incidents and the one that finally convinced Freud that he could not remain in Vienna. He had been reluctant to leave, both because of his age and illness, and because he could not fully believe that the civilization he had lived in for 80 years could produce what it was in the process of producing. He was persuaded to leave by the combination of family pressure and the intervention of influential supporters, including President Franklin Roosevelt, who instructed the American consul in Vienna to facilitate Freud's emigration. He left Vienna on June 4, 1938, with his wife and daughter Anna, never to return. He went to London, where he lived his last year in a house in Hampstead that is now the Freud Museum. He continued working in London, seeing patients and finishing Moses and Monotheism, a speculative work arguing that Moses had been an Egyptian, that the monotheism of the Israelites had been adopted from the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten's religious reforms, and that the violence and guilt associated with monotheism reflected the Oedipal dynamics of a community that had murdered its founding father. The book was provocative and poorly received by most scholars, both because the historical evidence for its central claims was thin and because its publication timing in the immediate aftermath of the Nazi persecution of European Jews was sensitive. Freud published it anyway. At 82, dying of cancer in exile, he was not inclined to self-censorship. He died on September 23, 1939, 3 weeks after the outbreak of the Second World War. He had asked his physician, Max Schur, to help him die when the suffering became intolerable, and Schur kept the promise. Schur administered a dose of morphine that ended the suffering, and Freud died peacefully. He was 83 years old. What Freud got wrong, the honest accounting. Freud's scientific legacy is contested in ways that deserve honest acknowledgement rather than apology or dismissal. Many of his most specific claims have not been supported by subsequent research, and some of them have been actively refuted. Understanding where he went wrong is not a way of dismissing him, but a necessary part of understanding what he actually contributed. The most fundamental methodological problem with Freudian theory is that it is extremely difficult to test in any straightforward empirical way. The mechanisms Freud proposed, repression, the unconscious, dream symbolism, the Oedipus complex, are formulated in ways that make clear falsification very difficult. If a patient remembers a childhood trauma, this confirms the theory. If a patient denies having had such experiences, this can be interpreted as resistance, which also confirms the theory. If a therapy produces improvement, this confirms psychoanalytic treatment. If it does not produce improvement, this can be attributed to the depth of the repression or the patient's resistance, which again preserves the theory. A theory that can accommodate any outcome is not a scientific theory in the strict sense. The specific claim about repression of childhood sexual trauma as the cause of adult neurosis, which was central to Freud's early theory, has been particularly problematic. Freud initially believed, on the basis of his clinical work, that his patients' neuroses were caused by actual childhood sexual abuse that they had repressed. He later revised this theory, arguing that the memories his patients reported were often fantasies rather than real events, and that it was the fantasy of childhood seduction rather than the reality of it that caused neurosis. This revision was controversial and has remained so. Critics have argued that Freud abandoned a true clinical discovery under social pressure because the alternative, acknowledging the widespread reality of childhood sexual abuse, was too disturbing to the social environment he operated in. The question of how often reported childhood memories of abuse represent actual events versus constructed memories remains a genuine and contested area of psychology. The efficacy of psychoanalytic treatment as Freud practiced it has also been questioned. The early studies that Freud cited as evidence for treatment success were anecdotal and methodologically unsophisticated by modern standards. Subsequent controlled research on psychoanalytic therapy, as distinct from psychoanalytically informed therapies that use some Freudian concepts, has produced mixed results. Shorter-term, more structured therapies, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, have shown stronger and more consistent evidence of effectiveness for many of the conditions that psychoanalysis was traditionally used to treat. This does not mean psychoanalytic therapy is ineffective, but it means the evidence base is much weaker than Freud believed it to be. The specific content of the unconscious that Freud proposed, primarily sexual and aggressive wishes of a very specific developmental character, has not been confirmed by the cognitive science research that has most thoroughly investigated unconscious processing. The unconscious that cognitive scientists study is vast and operates continuously, but it is primarily a matter of automatic processing, pattern recognition, and skilled performance, not a seething repository of repressed Oedipal wishes. The specific Freudian unconscious and the cognitive unconscious of modern psychology are not the same thing, even though both support the general claim that much mental processing occurs below conscious awareness. What Freud got right. The enduring contributions. Having acknowledged what Freud got wrong, which is important and often understated, it is equally important to be clear about what he got right, which is also often understated in the enthusiasm of contemporary critique. The foundational insight that mental life has depth, that there is more to the mind than what is available to conscious inspection, that the reasons people give for their behavior are often not the real reasons. That past experience continues to shape present experience in ways the person is not aware of. All of this has been substantially confirmed by subsequent research, and Freud was among the first to state it clearly, to make it the center of a systematic attempt to understand human psychology and to develop a method for investigating it clinically. The specific claim that early childhood experience has lasting effects on personality and adult functioning, that the relationships we have with our earliest caregivers create emotional templates that persist into adulthood and shape subsequent relationships, is one of the most robust findings in developmental psychology. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby partly in dialogue with psychoanalysis, has provided a more empirically grounded account of how early experience shapes later functioning. But the basic Freudian claim that early childhood matters enormously is correct. The clinical observation that symptoms often have meaning, that physical and emotional symptoms that appear inexplicable are often connected to psychological experience in ways that can be discovered and addressed, was genuinely novel in Freud's time and has been substantially validated. The field of psychosomatic medicine, the understanding that psychological states can produce physical symptoms, owes a significant debt to the clinical observations that Freud and Breuer documented in studies on hysteria. The recognition that conflict is central to mental life, that we are not unified beings with single clear desires, but creatures in whom competing impulses and competing demands are constantly negotiated, is a profound insight that has shaped not just psychology, but literature, philosophy, and ordinary self-understanding. The person who says, "I know I should stop, but I can't," or "I feel guilty, but I don't know why," or "I keep doing this even though I know it's bad for me." These are all expressions of the kind of internal conflict that Freud's structural model was designed to describe. And the talking cure itself, the idea that talking about one's psychological experience with a trained and attentive listener can produce therapeutic benefit, has been validated by the accumulated evidence of more than a century of psychotherapy research, even when the specific theoretical account of why the talking helps has shifted considerably from Freud's original formulation. The consulting room, the trained therapist, the 50-minute hour, the exploration of childhood and relationships and recurring patterns. All of this derives from Freud, and all of it has proven to have genuine value, even if not in exactly the way Freud explained it. Freud's legacy, how he changed the world. The influence of Freud on 20th and 21st century culture is so pervasive that it has become almost impossible to measure, because it is woven into the basic conceptual vocabulary with which educated people in the Western world understand themselves and each other. The vocabulary itself is the most obvious legacy. Unconscious, repression, projection, rationalization, denial, the Freudian slip, the id, the ego, the superego, neurosis, complex, libido, sublimation, transference. These words and concepts are now part of ordinary educated speech, used by people who have never read a word of Freud and who might be surprised to learn where the words came from. When someone says a person is in denial, or that they are projecting, or that they have a complex about something, they are using Freudian concepts that were not available to ordinary discourse before Freud. The influence on literature has been enormous and direct. The stream of consciousness technique in modernist literature, the attempt to render the continuous flow of mental life, including its unconscious undercurrents, is partly a Freudian project, even when the writers using it, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, William Faulkner, were not orthodox Freudians. The interest in the irrational, the dreamlike, the symbolically laden, that characterizes so much 20th century literature is partly a response to the Freudian revolution in understanding the mind. The influence on film is equally direct, especially in the Hollywood Golden Age when psychoanalysis was fashionable among the cultural elite. Hitchcock's films are saturated with Freudian themes: the repressed desire, the mother fixation, the guilt and the punishment, the return of the repressed. Countless films of the 1940s and 1950s used psychoanalytic frameworks to explain villain motivation and resolve plot complications. The entire genre of the psychological thriller owes a significant debt to the Freudian understanding of the mind as a site of hidden desires and dangerous secrets. The influence on how people think about child-rearing has been enormous and sometimes unfortunate. The mid-century belief that good maternal care could prevent neurosis, that emotional damage in childhood was the primary cause of adult psychological problems, that the mother's relationship with her infant was the determinant of the child's psychological health, derived in large part from popularized Freudian ideas, and produced a generation of mothers paralyzed by anxiety about whether they were doing it right. Freud himself cannot be held entirely responsible for the uses to which his ideas were put by popularizers, but the general trajectory from his theories to the mid-century focus on maternal responsibility is traceable. The influence on political and social thought has been less direct but equally significant. Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment, Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom, Wilhelm Reich's The Mass Psychology of Fascism. These works of the Frankfurt School and related traditions used Freudian frameworks to analyze the social and political conditions that produced fascism and authoritarian conformity. The idea that political and social phenomena had psychological roots, that the mass movements of the 20th century could only be understood by attending to the unconscious dynamics of crowds and leaders and followers, owed everything to Freud's foundational work. The couch in the room, sitting with Freud. It is late now, and I want to end not with legacy or with critique, but with something closer to the actual experience of Freud's consulting room, because the consulting room is where everything that matters about Freud's work actually happened. The couch is there. It is still there in the Freud Museum in London, where he spent his last year, covered in the same patterned rug that covered it in Vienna, surrounded by the antiquities that Freud collected obsessively throughout his life: the Egyptian figurines and the Greek vases and the Roman bronzes that covered every surface in his office and that he described as his silent companions. There is something in the space between the analyst's chair and the patient on the couch, in the darkness of the room, in the quality of attention that the analytic hour requires, that is genuinely its own thing, genuinely valuable regardless of the theoretical controversies that surround it. Freud invented a space in which a person could say anything, could follow the thread of their thought wherever it led without being judged or corrected or told that the thought was wrong or shameful. He invented the trained listener, the person whose job was to attend to what was said and what was not said, to hear the music underneath the words, to remain curious rather than shocked. He invented the idea that the story of a life, told fully and honestly, was itself a form of healing, that the examined life was not just philosophically desirable, but psychologically necessary. These inventions have proven more durable than any specific claim about the Oedipus complex or the meaning of dreams or the structure of the unconscious. The specific theoretical machinery has been revised and in some cases abandoned. The consulting room remains. The trained listener remains. The idea that talking about your experience with someone who is genuinely attending to it can produce insight and relief and change. This has survived everything that has been thrown at it, every critique, every revision, every alternative therapeutic approach. It survived because it is true, and because Freud was the first to understand it clearly enough to turn it into a practice. He was a difficult man. He was sometimes authoritarian, sometimes contemptuous of those who disagreed with him, sometimes wrong in ways that he refused to acknowledge. He chain-smoked through cancer and argued with his doctors, and outlived nearly every intellectual contemporary by the force of his will. He was also, by most accounts, an extraordinarily attentive and perceptive listener in the consulting room, a man who could hear things in what his patients said that the patients themselves could not yet hear, who could trace a pattern through the apparently random flow of association and say, "Here, this is what the symptom is pointing toward. This is what the dream is trying to say." That capacity, the capacity to listen to another person with full attention and to find the meaning in what they are saying when they do not know themselves what they mean, is one of the most valuable things a human being can offer another human being. Freud made it into a profession. Whatever else we think about him, that is a genuine gift to the world. Sleep well. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight.